Hello again, Dr. Childress back on Facebook Live. I can't seem to get any work done. No sooner do I start to walk and try to get anything done than I get another like email from the universe says talk about that. I go, no, I'm busy, and it says no now. So now I'm back because I just talked about Richard Gardner. I have to talk about false allegations of sex abuse, and it's always going to come here. This is going to inflame the pathogen tremendously because it's sex abuse pathogen. So any discussion of false allegations of sex abuse are just going to rocket up the inflammation on this. So guess what? I'm going to talk about it now. Um, what's important to understand is to put this in the context of a ripple of child abuse, and to understand that me, Dr. Childress, comes out of trauma and child abuse. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and psychological abuse is my zone of psychology diagnosis and treatment. And I've worked up close and personal with child abuse, neglect, and physical abuse, and sex abuse, and psychological abuse. So I take sex abuse and all child abuse extraordinarily seriously. And that's why I'm over here slamming the forensic people so hard. I take this extraordinarily seriously. So seriously that I came over here and started working with it. Because I just came over as a on one case, and I go, holy cow! And now I need to do something about it because it's my duty to protect. So everything I'm doing over here is pursuant to my professional obligations of duty to protect, um, because I see what's going on. I go, so I have duties. And so that, and then also ethical standards under Standard 1.05, that I have to do something about it. And so I tell people that's been my situation 1.04. So all this stuff, information I'm giving out, that's pursuant to Standard 1.04. I'm trying to informally uh, express my concerns to my professional colleagues regarding their unethical practices. So that's all the website information, all the letters, all the booklets, everything I'm doing on that. I've got a booklet, Professional Consultation, that I've written for parents to give to their mental health people that talk about the ethical issues. And that's kind of documentation to set you up for a licensing board or malpractice complaint. But I'm trying to, under my 1.04, let you know about that. But then also everything I'm doing over here is under 1.05, including the APA. A petition to the APA was under 1.05. The presentation with Dorset Pruder to the AFCC was under 1.05. I have obligations, and they're mandatory obligations. Ethics code is mandatory for psychologists, including standards 1.04 and 1.05. And duty to protect obligations are kind of mandatory. I come out of child abuse. I take child abuse very seriously. So let me discuss the child sex abuse and false allegations of sex abuse. Richard Gardner is wrong. Let me start with that. We should not apply the construct of parental alienation relative to sex abuse allegations, ever. That's not a relevant construct. We should not apply it. So hopefully I'm very clear on that. In addition, we never discount a child allegation of sex abuse. Never. We never discount it. We always investigate. And my personal opinion, I have a blog on this, my personal opinion on having to do with type 1 errors and type 2 errors. And so all the psychologists can go in the decision making criteria and look at this. So it's the risks of making a false negative decision or a false positive decision. And if you move the bar to catching or diagnosing authentic child abuse, you're going to make more false identifications of child abuse, but you're going to catch all of the sex abuse. Or you can move it so that you are more accurate and you have less false allegation identification, but then you're going to have more missed sex abuse. And so, from my perspective as a trauma psychologist, I'm moving that bar all the way this way. In terms of sex abuse, I don't want to miss a single case of sex abuse. That's it. Now, does that mean I might miss some false allegations from the child, where the child is reporting sex abuse and it didn't occur? Yeah, I'll miss some of those. I will, if the child says there's sex abuse and it didn't occur, and I believe the child, I will have a false negative, or yeah, a false positive. I will identify child abuse when it's not there because the child's telling you it's there. And so that's my criteria because I come out of child abuse. And I recognize the valid concerns over the PAS when it came up is we need to get disclosure out of the kids. That is the issue. We need to. And so when I work child abuse, and typically it doesn't show up as a child disclosure in us, in the therapists, in the surround of the trauma people. What it shows up as is the symptom patterns associated with. And when we see it, when we get enough of the themes and symptom patterns that we're saying, I'm looking at the child abuse pathology here, but it hasn't been disclosed by the child. What we do is we set up a context of support for the child that allows the child to disclose, either with the teachers or typically moms or parents. We like to set that up. Now, we don't induce, we don't ask, we set up the context for the disclosure, because that's all they need is no child wants to be sexually abused. They just don't believe there's a context there or availability to report. So we set up the context that will support the child, and then we get the disclosure, and then we move immediately to CPS because we don't investigate. The child discloses, CPS take a look at it because we want to protect the forensic evidence. In authentic child abuse, we want to protect the forensic evidence because we want to prosecute that person. So you don't mess with it. You don't look for it. You don't go messing with the forensic evidence, but you set up the context of that's available and supportive for the child, and ways to do that if you work trauma and you know what. And so you talk with the mom and you kind of work and get that place. The child discloses, immediately goes to CPS to protect the forensic reporting on what happened and how. So that's my status on authentic, or one version of the. Now, the differential diagnosis, though, is authentic child abuse by the parent, or potentially the persecutory or false allegation of child abuse, typically going from a borderline or from a parent who's got sex abuse history, and so it's not. Trauma is like a rock thrown into a lake. There's the rock of the abuse, the splash of the trauma, and then the ripple. And the ripple here is through time to the children. And so the trauma in the parent is being passed to the child. And so the themes are there. So we see the themes of child abuse, but it's not the rock, it's the ripple. And so that's confusing to people who don't work trauma. Is this actual sex abuse or is this a false allegation? That's the ripple. And so they're trying to figure it out, and it carries some of the same themes. So first off, I'm going to be very concerned about the sex abuse, and that very seriously. Now, there's never a sex abuse allegation when the child says, no, there's no sex abuse, and the allied parent does. If the child says there's no sex abuse, but the allied parent does, I'm more way over on the persecutory delusion on that, because I'm not even getting an allegation out of the child. So that's on the other spectrum. If I'm not getting a child allegation, then there's no there. Okay. And now if I don't have the symptom pattern, then I don't have the symptom pattern. And the symptom pattern is not what we're seeing over here in this parental alienation. That's not the symptom pattern of child abuse at all. But it's very clear when they see sex abuse versus when they see this false allegation ripple pathogen. But you guys don't know. You see a few of the same themes, and so you think it's there when it's not. Now, for false allegations, what you want to do is you're looking at a differential on that one. If there's no sex abuse and CPS says, no, we're not finding it, then you want to look the other direction for potential persecutory delusion. And that's not a matter of opinion, people. No. This is not opinion, it's diagnosis. Diagnosis based on symptoms. I don't have an opinion whether a person has autism. Does a child show the symptoms of autism? If they meet the symptom criteria, then yes, I apply the diagnosis. If they don't, I don't. We don't have like latitude to say, well, they don't meet the criteria, but I'm going to give you schizophrenia anyway. No, that's not how it works. So with delusions, those are thought disorders. The assessment for a thought disorder is a mental status exam of thought and perception. It's a sweep of the frontal lobe executive function systems, because a thought disorder is in delusion. It's in the executive function systems. So if you know how to kind of sweep them in your clinical interview, you will find a little pebble, a little rock of the delusion, because it's not logical, it's not rational, it's a thought disorder. And you just sweep the thought thinking system, and there it is. But it is a clinical skill to executive function system. It's not a common area that people work with. They tend to work more with the emotional system, the limbic system, prefrontal cortex, or prefrontal cortex regulation of the limbic system. Um, but the prefrontal cortex is actually part of the limbic system, even though it's up in the frontal cortex. So most people tend to work down on the emotional limbic zone, and there's not very many people who know the cognitive systems of the executive function system. They're relevant in ADHD. That's how I got into them. They're a deficit in ADHD, so I was looking all over the place. And they're explanatory of a huge amount of stuff. Is the frontal lobe executive function systems. Um, Most sensitive, last to develop, and the mental status exam of thought and perception is a skilled interview. But it needs to be done if you're dealing with delusional pathology, because that's a thought disorder pathology. So to assess thought disorders, you need to do the assessment for thought disorders. So people over here in court involved psychology, holy cow, it's a problem now, and it's been a problem for the last 40 years or however long you've been doing that you're not exercising proper care in the assessment of the potential diagnoses that are being presented to you. This could be excuse me, a delusional pathology imposed on the child, and you're getting a false allegation. So I have been involved now on two false allegations of child abuse cases, and one as a consultant and one as a direct assessor. And in the assessment that I was court ordered to do surrounding a case of false allegations or allegations of sexual abuse, concerns about sexual abuse, I conducted the clinical assessment to determine whether there was what the risk assessment was relative to the allegations. And they had been investigated by CPS, so there had been prior investigations. So I'm being brought in because it just doesn't seem to go away here. We're investigating, nobody's finding sex abuse, but we continue to hear these allegations or concerns about is dad a problem. And so they brought me in, court ordered me in, and there was a court order for I'm a court reporter also in my clinical interview. I like that. I would if I'm ever doing a clinical assessment personally, I would like a court reporter or some transcript produced of the clinical assessment. Then I can just show where the delusion is, show it to the judge. Judge can see it, everybody, because it's a standard assessment. We don't make diagnosis of a delusion based on history or stuff. We actually, that's the frontal lobe. We take it out, we look at it. I can rate features of it. I can rate it on the BPRS, brief psychiatric, or the PANS. So I can give the court ratings about how the severity of the delusion, and I can look in the interview and show you exactly why. It has to do with functional impairment and level of conviction to the delusion and that sort of thing. So and yeah, and then you want to look encapsulated or scope, and so I can show all the transcript of it all the time. I would do that all the time. So if I'm in our clinic, we had I think two, maybe one, but I think two one-way mirror rooms where be in a session, trainees and people could be on the other side, or I could be on the other side and they'd be doing that. So we do observations all the time. We videotape our therapies for supervision stuff. So I have no wants to put a transcript, put a reporter in my clinical interviews. But that's what the psychology needs to be doing. Besides that, though, people say, "Oh, I want to get Dr. Childress to assess," and yeah, I can, but we need to get people in your area to assess. So if you look at the description on the NCBI return, if you Google mental status exam, it says people often consult, and that's true. And so I shouldn't be out there doing everyone because I'm only one human, but the mental health people should be consulting and learning the skills of the mental status exam and how to assess for thought disorder pathology so that we can start doing it with all families everywhere instead of just one psychologist up here in Seattle who is knowledgeable. Now, the mental status exam of thought perception but it's over in schizophrenia. It's not here in court involved stuff, and you won't find it in school, and you won't. It's a schizophrenia or bipolar people who may know it, but they don't work this stuff, and they don't work attachment pathology, so they're not competent to come over and do it over here because it's not attachment stuff. Yeah, they would. Yeah, actually, a mental status exam of thought and perception will pick up a delusion no matter who does it. It's very confined, looking at. Um, and so I've done that, and so I provided the transcript and I for the court and did that, and it was a delusional disorder. So you meet with the assess, you do that, you identify the delusion, and then I meet with the child, and it's a very gentle interview with the child because I don't want to distress, but I basically want to get that they share the same belief, that they have this persecutory fear about the parent or concerns about the parent or belief that the parent has malevolent intentions towards them, and it's not true. And I will do a nice clinical interview with the kid to make sure it's not true and look at that. But when it's not true, then I'm looking at delusion. And if I've got it in the parent and it's I see it in the parent and then I see it in the child, I got the shared delusion. And once we have the shared delusion, the diagnosis becomes the psychological child abuse, protective separation. And so now we got the child abuse on the other side, and that the allegations of child abuse are actually a projection. Because when you and borderline personality, that's pretty primitive. And we get to what's called primary process thinking. So we're way down on the defensive processes. We're into the denial zone of reality. You can see that in the social surround. You just deny reality. And so it's a very primitive, that's the lowest defense. And right above that is projection. And so with narcissistic and borderline pathology, we see a lot of projection. That's one of the defenses we see. And so if I've got a parent accusing the other parent of being abusive and it's false, yeah, it's a projection. They kind of unconsciously know they're abusing the child and they're trying to get us to stop them. But if you're not like a psychologist and you don't realize what you're treating, you don't hear that communication that it's a projection because you believe the delusion. And if you believe the delusion, you become part of the delusion. And oh my God, you're the child abuser then. So it's really, really important with a shared delusional pathology that we get a diagnosis. Because if you believe the delusion, the child, because you believe the delusion and you're part of it and creating it. So the idea that people are going and doing treatments and recommendations about custody and things without first making a diagnosis of whether it's real or delusional is extraordinarily problematic. The idea that forensic psychologists are not doing a proper assessment for thought and perception and thought disorders, and so are not informing the court whether or not this might be a delusion. Oh my goodness, that's a problem. And if you note in their guidelines for child custody evaluations that are up right now, the current from the AFCC, they recommend that we don't, or the forensic psychology people, don't use diagnostic labels. Now, they don't say don't use them. They just encourage that they not use diagnostic labels because get this, they might be prejudicial, but more prejudicial than probative. So they've got the psychologist deciding whether this is going to be prejudicial or probative, and then disclosing or not withholding diagnostic information from the court based on the psychologist's opinion whether it's prejudicial or probative. Which I wonder, prejudicial to who? Oh, the parent with the pathology. Yeah, I bet it's very probative to the one without the pathology. They'd like to prove the other parent's pathological, but it'd be prejudicial. And so we don't like diagnostic labels. They don't like to identify the pathology. They just like to fight and argue. Diagnosis guides treatment. How do they know what their recommendations are if they don't know if it's cancer or diabetes? It's insane, absolutely insane. But they feel entitled. They feel exempt from the rules that other people have to follow. They can just, ethics code, who cares? They're forensic psychologists. So returning again and closing off this false allegations discussion, we need to bring this back into clinical psychology. Child sexual abuse is hugely problematic. Yes, we need to get disclosures on it. We need to address it. And this is one of the issues. This is a ripple of it. This is coming from those little girls who are now grown up and then never had treatment. And so to a certain extent, they're crying out for help, for treatment. And they're saying, I need treatment around relationships. I need treatments around my fears and my fears for my safety, my everything about but people are misunderstanding that communication from the trauma survivor, And so we are believing the trauma survivor and colluding with their pathology and their abuse against their spouse and the child. Um, but we're also not providing them with the help that they need to become the parent that doesn't ripple that trauma into the child. Um, and the pathology, my final statement on this, the pathology will inflame tremendously around the sex abuse allegations. And so it's very important that we always, like election fraud, we always investigate election fraud. That is immensely important. An invalid election and our democracy is lost. So election fraud is taken very seriously, and we look at it very seriously. But when there's no there, then we look the other direction. And looking the other direction is not just a matter of opinion. It's actually a diagnosis. We're looking at a thought disorder, a delusion, and a particular type of delusion or extension of the delusion, which is a shared delusion, shared persecutory delusion. And it's encapsulated, just like election fraud. It's not delusional about everything, it's just this one little area. And so, as the mental health people and the court system, it will benefit us tremendously if we pathology is, and in our response to the allegations, slander, attacks relative to child abuse pathology, so that we can take a balanced and effective approach to protecting all children 100% of the time from all forms of child abuse: physical, sexual, neglect, and psychological. And it's the psychological area that we need to begin to pay particular attention to, with recognition of the other domains as well. So with that, that's my statement on false allegations of sex abuse. Let the games begin on the allegations on me.